Good morning, everyone. So, in our last lesson, we looked at the Byzantine Empire, which was the continuation of Rome during the Middle Ages in the East. Today, we are still looking at the Eastern Mediterranean and at a very important moment for the history of the entire world, the rise of a new religion, Islam. Without going too much into detail about religion, we will try to explain the reasons why Islam was so successful and why a bunch of tribesmen who lived at the fringes of the so-called civilized world were able within 10 years essentially to conquer an empire stretching from Spain to the borders of China. In particular, we're going to look at the following points. So, at the Great Crisis, meanwhile, in the East, so what was going on in the Eastern Mediterranean in the 6th and early 7th century, then at the so-called War of the Three Gods, and then finally we're going to ask ourselves, why was Islam successful? So, the Great Crisis. Now, our analysis of the rise of Islam will not start from Arabia, but from Constantinople, the capital of the Roman Empire, some 60 years before the Prophet Muhammad was even born. By the year 541, things were going pretty well for the Romans, all things considered. After a series of long and bloody wars against the Vandals and the Goths, two barbarian peoples who had invaded the empire in the previous century, the Romans were able to recover North Africa and Italy, two rich and important provinces. The Emperor Justinian was overseeing a vast program of constructions all over the empire, and he had just completed a long project of systematization of all the laws of the Roman world. Together with his charming and ambitious wife, Theodora, he was able to keep the empire together despite the lack of money, religious and ethnic divisions, and a constant state of war with the Persians. Things were looking good, until 541. In that year, ships carrying grain from Egypt to Constantinople also brought with them an unwanted visitor, the bubonic plague. The so-called Justinian's plague is possibly the most important historical event you have never heard of. In the short term, it debilitated the emperor for a while, it killed his wife, together with about a third of the population of the Roman Empire. Archaeological evidence shows an almost complete collapse of urban civilization, so city-based civilization in the Mediterranean in the following 50 years. In Constantinople itself, for example, so many people died every day that the traditional burial services paid by the government, which generally took people who were dead and buried them outside the walls, was not able to keep going. They were not able to keep burying the bodies of the dead outside the walls. Private citizens began burying their own dead relatives in their own backyards because nobody was able to pick them up. This is how bad the situation was. It was a complete disaster. But things were about to get worse. Within the next 50 years, Italy was invaded by the Lombards, a barbarian people coming from Scandinavia, while the Balkans were overrun by the Avars and the Slavs, which is why today most of the Balkans, like in Serbia, Croatia, Bosnia and Montenegro, speak a Slavic language. The empire was now less populated, and therefore there were fewer people who could pay taxes. What happens when you have less taxes? It means that you cannot field large armies, so the armies were smaller and less effective. Since they were paid less, they also mutinied and rebelled, as Phocas did in 601. And they started a civil war which further weakened the country. So, and by the way, since we're speaking of Phocas, this is the column of Phocas. Phocas was a rebel soldier who decided to become emperor in the year 602. He was also the last Roman emperor to visit Rome, to visit the city of Rome, and to make a monument in the city of Rome, which is this column here. Now, if that wasn't enough, in the same year of Phocas' mutiny, in 602, the Persians decided to launch an invasion. Okay? So things within 60 years of the plague were not looking so good anymore. The Persian invasion of 602 was the beginning of the so-called War of the Three Gods, which was a huge conflict which began with a war between the Persians and the Romans between 602 and 628, and which ended with the explosive expansion of the Muslim armies out of Arabia after 632. For the Persians, the war offered a chance to finally get rid of the Romans, who had been an aggressive and tenacious enemy for the previous 600 years, if we consider the Parthians to be Persians. They saw their weakness and exploited it to occupy Syria and Egypt. For the Romans, it was a struggle for survival. For 22 years, they bravely resisted all the Persian attacks, fighting a war on multiple fronts both in the east and in the west, with a destroyed economy and a small army, until in 624, led by Emperor Heraclius, the Romans were able to go on the offensive, eventually reaching the Persian capital of Ctesiphon in 627. When the Persians had conquered Jerusalem in Palestine, they had taken the true cross where Jesus was allegedly crucified. So when Heraclius, the Roman emperor, eventually took the Persian capital Ctesiphon, or sacked the area around the city of Ctesiphon, he made sure to extinguish all the eternal fires that were sacred to the Persian Zoroastrian religion. The war had become so huge and so embedded in the people's mind that it had stopped being about politics. It was now about religion. In the end, however, nobody won. The two powers were just too exhausted to continue fighting, and they agreed to sign a peace treaty in which no land changed hands. All that fighting had been for nothing, as it had been for the previous 600 years. However, the Romans and the Persians didn't know that this was the last war that they would fight against each other. Seemingly out of nowhere, from the depth of the Arabian Peninsula, the successors of Prophet Muhammad launched a series of raids against the two empires, which soon became wars of conquest. It was something huge, okay, and completely unexpected. Out of nowhere, try as they might, neither the Romans nor the Persians, even when they banded together, they were unable to stop the armies of Islam. And by 642, 10 years after the death of the Prophet Muhammad, the Persian Empire had almost completely disappeared, was losing a war against the Arabs, and the Romans were on the defensive and had lost the entirety of Palestine, Egypt and Syria. So, why? Why was Islam so successful? How could this happen? How could the two most powerful states of the ancient world be toppled by a bunch of Bedouins who had never been a threat before? So historians have found several reasons. Again, it's like with the Roman Empire, there are hundreds of reasons. We're just focusing on a few of them today, okay? So the first one is exhaustion. Both the Romans and the Persians had spent all their energies fighting each other in the largest war the ancient world had ever seen, okay? Neither power had the money or the manpower needed to fight another war. They were like two old boxers who had given their very best to defeat an old enemy and were both absolutely completely knackered when all of a sudden a new young champion, all fresh and ready to fight, jumps into the ring. It was this kind of situation. Then we got internal divisions. Both the Persians and the Romans were deeply divided inside their own countries. The Persians were in the middle of a civil war between claimants to the throne, people who thought that they would be a better emperor than the guy sitting on the throne, when the Arabs invaded. The Roman Empire, on the other hand, was deeply divided in terms of religion. The people in Egypt and Syria were Miaphysite Christians, okay, while the rest of the empire was Orthodox Christian. These two groups were both Christians, but Orthodox Christianity was the official religion, and the Miaphysites, so the people in Syria and in Egypt, were not treated very well by the Roman rulers, okay? And in fact, they were treated better by the Muslims than they were by the Romans. This is why they welcomed them in many cases. Then we got religion. Islam had given a moral advantage to the Arabs. Okay, they felt that they had God on the side, and this made them fight much more bravely against their enemies. They also saw how religiously divided and weakened the Christians were, and this made them more convinced of the justness of their cause. We cannot think of the rise of Islam if we do not understand that Christianity was deeply divided. into people discussing all sorts of things about who Jesus was, and was it really God, was it really a man, what was his position compared to God in the Trinity. Islam, on the other hand, has only have one God, and very likely this insistence of there only being one God comes exactly from seeing how much the Christians bickered between each other, from this sort of sense of superiority. We received the revelation of the one true God while you're still fighting that. And this is probably one of the factors that might have given a bit of an edge to the Muslim armies. Then we got geography. Most of the fightings in the early years of the Muslim expansion took place in the deserts of Syria, Mesopotamia, and Egypt. The Arab Bedouins, who were born and raised in the desert, were more able to fight in those areas than the Romans or the Persians. So, what do you think is the most important cause? Today's question is, what caused the rise of Islam? To get the bronze level, you have to describe the historical period of the rise of Islam. So, what was going on at the time? So you can describe maybe the war between the two empires, you can say that they were weakened, and so on. To get a silver level, you also have to explain at least two reasons that allowed the Muslims to expand so fast in the early years, and to get a gold, you have to do that, and also evaluate which one do you think was the most important cause for the rise of Islam. Looking forward to read what you can write, as always, and see you next time.